All right, so we're continuing at the bottom of Horayos 2a. The Mishnah says whether the judges perform the transgression and the person together. So the Mishnah first uses this as either together or one after the other or alone, and then it's talking about where you're relying on the base, and therefore you're potter from a korban. This is the view of the Mishnah. And then later it says if you're a chacham, where apparently you should rely on your own wits. If you know that they're making a mistake, that's the pashtus seems of the Gemara. But it's then you're chayav. But it should go also in incremental value. It should say you're chayav if you're the one following the Beis Din's advice without them following it, and that you're at the highest level of independence. Then even if you're following right after they followed their own advice, and then even if you're doing it together, in all those cases you'd be independent. That's the way it should read it. But it reads it the bottom the same as the top. First the case of where you're together, then if you follow them, and then if you're independent. Doesn't seem to match. That's what the Gemara is asking. Lama leila misna kol hani bishma reisha lazu afsuktani elo seifa delechiyuva ifcha miboile zu ve'ein tzarich lomar zuktani. So the Gemara is saying it's teaching it in another fashion, which is lo zu that this, and I don't even have to tell you the other. So it's a different method of listing things. If some guy is really smart, he knows the Beis Din is off, and it seems repetitive. It's either because it says Yoda, and then Talmud V'roi L'ra, or maybe Talmud V'roi L'ra. There's some repetitiveness here. Tarti Lamali, why the repetitiveness? Amarava Itzrok to tell you, because I might think it's only somebody who's really knowledgeable, learned and on his own. Also, if a guy's only studied but he's not that independently smart, maybe that's not really the type of smart person we're talking about. So therefore, Kamash Malan that even if he is learned but he's not so independently smart, he's still a person that would fit the definition of somebody that should use his own, follow his own instincts, his own thoughts. Amar Abaye said, Lo'ira gamir usavir mashma. Abaye said that Lo'ira gamir usavir mashma. When it says Lo'ira, the guys can advise and all that, it sounds like he's really very knowledgeable. So it seems repetitive. Knowledgeable is basically what it's saying in the Mishnah. So what for? Amale ana hachi kamina. This is what I was saying. Imahi havamina hanimili gamer savir. Ava gamer velo savir lo tanu roi lo ra mimishne seira afilu gamer velo savir savir lo gamer. In other words, saying it is repetitive, but by repeating it, somebody who's not learned and knowledge is basically somebody who knows. So that just tells you, since you don't need it to tell you the same thing twice, it's basically coming to tell you, even somebody who's limited, that they studied, but they don't really have much independent knowledge. Either way, that's a smart guy, that he should follow his own knowledge if he sees that it's clearly that they're making a mistake in the Beis Din. Okay. That seems to be the pashtus. Roi lahai ra v'chulei. Mishnah says qualified to issue halachic rulings. Kigon man, like who? Amar Rava, Kigon Shimon Azai, v'Shimon Zoyma. So these big rabbis, they're very knowledgeable, and so therefore, if they see that the Beis Din is doing wrong, they should follow their own advice. Amar Le'abai said, Ki hoi gavna mezitu. But if they don't follow their own advice, aren't they just doing intentional avera? L'tamech, really, you think so? Hadisanyo, that which we learn, be'asto achas, and performing one, yochid ha'oisa mipi atzmo chayav, means a person who's doing a sin on his own, that's someone who's chayav. By Rosh Beis Din, he's relying on the Beis Din potter, he'd be innocent, immune. Kate said, how is that? Horu Beis Din shechalav motar, v'nod lechal man sheto. If the Beis Din says that eating chayev is mutter, and one guy, a smart guy, knows that they're wrong, or Talmud Yosh lifnei v'roi le'hiro kegon Shimon Azai, like Shimon Azai, yochol yeh potter. I might think maybe he's potter if he's following the Beis Din instead of his own knowledge. Talmud Lemar ba'asto achas. No, it's what you do alone. In other words, he's responsible for his own behavior. He should have done what's right. Yachid always al piatzmo chayav. If a yachid does on his own, he chooses to go against what he knows, he's chayav. But Ros Beis Din, but if he really doesn't know and he's just following the Beis Din, then he's potter. Eleich mashkachos law. So how is it that you find a case where somebody's very knowledgeable and yet we say that they're potter? Okay. Okay. Kegon de yodo de osur v'kotoi b'mitzvos lishmor dever chachamim. So if he knows that something is forbidden, but he thought that he honestly thought he had to follow what the rabbis say, and that was an error on his part, but he thought that's what he's supposed to do, and he did that. So then we're going to say it's potter because he made an honest mistake. L'dinami the tohu b'mitzvos lishmor dever chachamim. He didn't make a mistake by knowing what's kosher, what's not, but he made the mistake that he thought he honestly supposed to follow the rabbi. So I think that's one way to read this. If he honestly thought he had to do so then that's something that we could find him immune for. But if he knows that that's not something he's supposed to do, then of course, we're not going to let him just rely on that. Okay, Zeh klal. This is the general rule. If a person relies on themselves, their own decision making, they're responsible for the decisions. What does that come to include? Somebody who normally rejects what the rabbis tell him. So even if he's following it and the Beis Din said it and later the Beis Din is wrong, we don't say they're relying on it. If he has a habit of always being a rejecter, we assume he's a rejecter and we don't let him use the immunity of reliance on a Beis Din. Toile be Beis Din, what about if a person, we say, is relying on a Beis Din, that they're immune? What does that come to include? Means that if the Beis Din made a mistake and this guy isn't aware of the change, that they vacated the judgment, he's relying on an old advisory opinion or old ruling, so then he is going to be immune. But didn't we learn? We're going to learn this later on. It's true, but here we're mentioning it anyways, and later we get into it more. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Mashmuel, Zudiver Rabbi Yehuda. This is the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds our Mishnah that if you follow the Beis Din, you're innocent. Rabbis say, Yochid she'asa be'ora Beis Din chayav. If an individual follows the advice of the Beis Din, it's chayav. So doesn't matter. You can't rely on the court. You live through the consequence of your actions. My Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda? The Sanya, it says, there's a brayso that says, Im nefesh achas techate b'shgaga ba'soisa, hari elu shlosha miutin. These are three miutin, three limitations from here. Ha'oisa mi piatzmo chayav. If a person does on their own, they're chayav. By Ros Beis Din, patur. So you see, this is the brayso from Yehuda, and it uses this concept of shlosha miutin. We're going to see later that's a typical way of writing for Rabbi Yehuda, and what he gets here is that the conclusion that the same idea that if a person relies on themselves, they're going to be responsible for that, but if they're relying on the Beis Din, they're going to be patur, and that is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The rabbis hold differently. My Rabbanan, Desanyo, Adayin ani omer miut kal shechotu chayovin. Because I might say that a small portion of the kehillah, of the community, sin by following the court, they're chayavin. They still have to. I might think they have to bring their korban, even though they're relying on the court, but they have to bring their korban chatas. It's only minority. Shem Beis Din mevin al yedei and par. Because since they're a minority of the community, not a majority, so the Beis Din is not going to bring a par helam for them. Rov kal shechotu Yupturin. But if it's a majority, I might think that they should be Patur. Shari based in Mevin Ayadeh Par, because there's already a Par Halam. Talmud Babli Horayos Me'amo Aretz Afilu Ruba Afilu Kula, means it doesn't matter from what it is from the land, a little, a lot. The point is, if anybody sins negligently, they have to bring a korban chatas. B'mai. So, in what circumstances the majority of the congregation sin? Ilema bishkagos maise. If you want to say maise based in shelo be'ora, they're just doing what's in the halacha book, but there's no special judgment. Then based in ma'ivdesayu. So then, what are we analyzing in the Brisa discussion of the par if it has nothing to do with a ruling of the court? Shelo be'odas based in mi maisi shelo be'ora. So if we're not talking about shelo be'oras basin, we're not talking about a judgment from the basin mi maisi shelo be'ora, we wouldn't be talking about bringing a par. That would be irrelevant. Elo be'ora, obviously we're talking about the basin giving advice, an opinion, a ruling. V'ho ki ksiv me'am ha'aretz, but when it says me'am ha'aretz, bishkagos maisehu lichsiv, that teaches you that everybody's responsible for bringing korban chatas for any sin they do, regardless of where they got their idea. Elalav hachikamar. So rather, is it not this about which the Tana is saying, that the Brisa is incomplete and must be taught in the following manner? Elalav hachikamar. This is what it's trying to say. Miut kahal shechatu bishkagos ma'aseh chayavin. That if a small portion of the group of the community sin, then they're obligated to bring, negligently, they have to bring korban chatas. She'ein based in Mevin Ayadein Par Bara, because there is no korban par halam for minority. Hahen chayavin. So therefore, they have to, in fact, bring their korban chatas. Yochel rov tzibur she'os v'shkagos ma'aseh yupturin. I might think even a majority of the community that sin negligently, they're going to be patur. Shaharei based in Mevin Aleim Par Bara, because the community is going to bring a par which is similar. Talmud Lama, the Torah teaches you me'am haaretz afilu ruba. Torah teaches you from the word me'am haaretz that even if there's a majority of the community that's falling based in the wrong way, they're gonna each have to bring their korban pesach, korban chatas. That's to be the rabbis. Amar of your Papa said, Mimai, how do you know that? Dima lohan v'lo basin. How do you know that? Maybe nobody has to bring any korban chatas if there's reliance on a court, like Rabbi Yehuda holds. If that's true, my iri. But the problem is from this brisa, it doesn't fit into this brisa because my iri de kamehader aruba lechyuva. Why would the brisa start talking about majority? Do they have to bring it? There's no korban par. Lav michlal de miut beiro kaima lei de michayvo beiro. In other words, if you want to lav michlal de miut beiro kaima lei de michayvo beiro. Hold on. Lav michlal de miut beiro. Since kaima lei de michayvo beiro. Now, since we're already establishing that if it's a smaller amount, of the minority that have sinned, that they're each going to have to bring korban chatas, so that would be obvious that even if it's a majority, wouldn't it be true like that? So in other words, first teach me the minority, because we don't really know about the minority. So why start talking about the majority if the majority followed the sin of the court? Start talking about the minority, because that's something we don't know. And you start small, grow big, develop the story. So isn't it only because if you have a minority, they're following the advice of a court on a judgment, so we have to establish that first. And then, then we can go to the top based on this miut case, the mechayev ishkagos ma'aseh, by saying they're chayav by to bring korban chatas by following the court. And afterwards, at the end, and then we can go on to the case where discussing where majority of the court, of the community, has followed the court in its wrong decision, and explain the issue there, that why they should be liable. But rather, since we didn't start the conversation in that manner, and then only afterwards we went, and then furthermore, since we did not start by discussing the miyut, by saying that there should be chayav when there's a negligence, ubesoif mehader aruba b'shiguras ma'aser, and we end up basically moving on to by going directly to the case of rove, and or at least the way we concluded, because we had a havamina that if it's rove they wouldn't have to, but then we brought a pasuk why they would. So we basically come out at the end that there is a requirement when it's a majority following the wrong way. Shema Mina, this whole tells us that miud be'roch hayovin, that it's undisputed that when there's a minority of the community that is following a court, that they're chayav hen kispo sa'ira, whether it's a female lamb or a female goat. V'shelo be'ra, and if it is a case where it's not a beis din giving a judgment on a particular halachak ruling, if that's not the case, so then v'shelo be'ra b'shgogos ma'aseh chayavim. So then, for sure, even on a case of majority, there would be no par involved over there, and then people are doing a sin that has nothing to do with the court making a decision, they're just doing negligently a sin, then they are going to be responsible for that behavior. Michti tarvayu. Okay, so tarvayu stame tanan. The two brises don't tell us who the author is. Mimai de kamaiso Rabbi Yehuda Basrais Rabbanan. So how do you know to say that the first one was Rabbi Yehuda and the last one was Rabbanan? Emayivcha, perhaps the alternative way. Manshmas le the darish miuta kihoi gavno. So we're doing a semantic. We saw that from Rabbi Yehuda, we saw his brisa said something like some kind of exclusions. So that's his style, always talking exclusions. So manshmas le the darish miut. Who's this rabbi who darshans miutim, exclusions? Kihoi gavna, in that manner, similar to the language we saw in the Brisa. We Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda, and we see it here where it says the sign of Rabbi Yehuda in a different place. Zois Toras ha'oilahi. This is the law of the burnt offering. It is that which goes up on one pyre on the altar. And then it said Hare Elu Shloisha Miutin. And these are the three exclusionary terms. And as far as says, this, the burnt offering, and it is, which serve to exclude three offerings concerning which the halacha is that even if they are placed on the altar, they are subsequently removed. A burnt offering slaughtered at night, a burnt offering whose blood was spilled before it was sprinkled, and a burnt offering whose blood was taken outside the courtyard. Apparently, it is Rabbi Yehuda who interprets multiple exclusionary terms. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.